Sign it, my father hissed, thrusting the papers at me. For a car? I asked quietly. For your silence, my sister smirked. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. You're unstable, Quartz. This is for the family. I signed. 12 years later, the banker whispered, You're the only buyer. My sister cried. My parents begged. I closed the folder and said, Now you know what it feels like to be erased. That night wasn't about celebration. It was about control, reputation, and who would be sacrificed to preserve the illusion. I didn't arrive seeking revenge or forgiveness. I came to observe, to listen, to remember who I used to be before silence became my armor. The room glittered with wealth and denial, and I took my place where I always had. The crystal chandeliers of the Lake Forest ballroom hummed with a low, expensive vibration, casting a golden net over the crowd. I stood near the marble buffet, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched. To the 300 guests gathered for my parents' 40th anniversary, I was just a background detail, as stationary and unremarkable as the silk draperies. In this world, appearance isn't just a choice. It's the only currency that buys you a seat at the table. I watched my mother, Idella, smoothing the lace on her gown, her eyes darting around the room to ensure every floral arrangement was positioned for maximum envy. My father, Gunnar, stood beside her, his posture rigid, radiating the kind of stoic pride that usually masks a profound hollow. They were a portrait of the American dream achieved, a testament to decades of careful curation. But as I looked at them, a realization settled in my chest like silt. A house built entirely on image has no room for a soul. Quartz, dear, you're hovering again, Idella whispered as she glided past, her smile never reaching her eyes. Go mingle. Try to look approachable. Approachable. It was her code for, don't let them see your mind working. I watched Talus, my older sister, commanding the center of the ballroom. She was the golden child, a master of the social dance, laughing at the right moments and touching people on the arm with practiced warmth. She was the light they all gathered around, and I was the dark matter that kept the gravity of their perfection in place. I spent the next hour moving through the periphery. I didn't need to be the center of attention. Instead, I found myself helping an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, navigate the steps to the garden, or quietly ensuring the catering staff had enough water. I've always believed that true power isn't found in a loud voice, but in a heart that refuses to harden despite the cold. Have you ever felt that? Like you're the only one in a crowded room who can see the cracks in the foundation while everyone else is busy admiring the wallpaper? The music suddenly dipped into a soft, expectant hush. Talus stepped toward the large projection screen at the front of the hall. Mom, Dad, she began, her voice amplified and trembling with faux emotion. We wanted to celebrate not just your years together, but the family you built. Even the parts that have been challenging. A slideshow began. Photos of Talus winning equestrian trophies. Talus at her graduation. Talus, Talus, Talus. Then the screen flickered. A document appeared, replacing the family photos. It was a letterhead from a prominent psychiatric clinic. My name, Quartz, was highlighted in a harsh neon yellow at the top. Underneath, in clinical, cold type, were words like schizotypal tendencies, unstable emotional regulation, and risk of delusional projection. It was a fabricated psychological report, a surgical strike of slander disguised as a family tribute. The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like the air had been sucked out of a vacuum. I felt 300 pairs of eyes pivot toward me. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a dangerous freak who had been hidden away for their protection. Talus gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh no, that wasn't supposed to be in there. I'm so sorry, Quartz. I just wanted to show how much we've supported you through your episodes. The gaslighting was masterful. She was branding me a monster while presenting herself as the long-suffering saint. I looked at Gunnar and Idella. I waited for the defense. I waited for my father to roar in anger at the violation of his daughter's privacy. I waited for my mother to pull me close. Instead, they looked away. Gunnar's face flushed deep red, not with rage, but with embarrassment. Idella turned her back to me, adjusting her pearls as if she could scrub the shame from her skin. The greatest distance in the world isn't measured in miles. It's the distance between a child in pain and a parent who chooses their pride over their blood. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I walked toward the front of the room, the crowd parting as if I were a contagion. I approached my mother. She was trembling. I didn't argue. I didn't demand an explanation. I reached out and gently fixed her corsage, which had slipped during the commotion. "I don't hold this against you, Mother," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "You can't see the fire when you're the one holding the match." I turned and walked toward the study, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Gunnar caught up with me at the door, his hand gripping my shoulder with a force that was more desperate than firm. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask who had made the report. "You need to leave, Quartz," he said, his voice a low, jagged hiss. "Tallis is right. Your presence here is a liability. For the sake of the family standing, you need to disappear for a while, just until this blows over." He disappeared. I looked at him and saw the man I had tried to please for 18 years. In that moment, I realized that my family saw my intelligence as a threat and my silence as a weapon. Sometimes you have to let the bridge burn down just to prevent the fire from spreading to your heart. If you've ever been the one to leave with a broken heart, you know that the first step is the hardest, but also the most necessary. "I understand, Father," I said. My voice was calm, which seemed to unnerve him more than if I had shouted. I went to the coat closet and retrieved my bag. On the hall table, I placed a small velvet box, a hand-restored heirloom brooch I had spent months finding and fixing for Idella. It was a token of a history I still valued, even if they had decided I was no longer a part of their future. It was my final act of grace in a house that had run out of it. I pushed open the heavy oak doors. The Illinois winter had arrived early. The air was sharp and smelled of incoming snow. As the doors began to swing shut, I heard a sound from the ballroom. It was Tallis. She was laughing, a light, tinkling social laugh that signaled the party was back on track. She thought she had won. She thought the freak had been discarded like yesterday's trash. But as the lock clicked behind me, I felt a strange, cold clarity. She had erased me from their ledger, but she had also released me from their debt. I was the only one in that room who actually knew the passwords to the offshore accounts and the reality of the business's failing margins. The wind began to howl across the driveway, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice forming in my veins. The heavy oak doors of the Lake Forest estate didn't just close, they sealed a tomb. I stood on the driveway, the wind already beginning to bite through my thin coat. The Illinois winter was no longer a background detail. It was an active participant in my erasure. Within seconds, the golden glow of the mansion felt like a star light years away, beautiful but utterly cold. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling the weight of the only life I had ever known resting heavily on my shoulder. A sudden, sharp cry shattered the silence of the night. It came from the hallway, muffled by the stone walls, but unmistakable. I pivoted, my boots crunching on the fresh layer of frost. Through the side glass of the entrance, I saw Tallis stumbling into the foyer. She was clutching her arm, her face a mask of calculated agony. At her feet lay the shattered remains of the Dresden porcelain vase, an heirloom Gunnar prized above almost everything else. My father and Idella rushed into the frame, their faces pale with shock. Tallis pointed a trembling finger toward the door, toward me. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear the words, the narrative was clear. Quartz had snapped. Quartz had attacked her. I watched, frozen, as Gunnar's face transformed into something unrecognizable, a jagged snarl of disappointment and protective fury. In a house of mirrors, the one who tells the truth is always seen as the distortion. I didn't reach for the handle to defend myself. Instead, I reached into my pocket and made sure the voice recorder I had activated during the gala was still running. I stood perfectly still, an empty-handed statue in the dark, while the people who shared my DNA chose to believe a theater of lies. The door flew open. Gunnar didn't step out. He loomed in the threshold. Behind him, Idella was hovering, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. She was shivering, the draft from the open door cutting through her silk evening wrap. Despite the venom in the air, I felt a pang of genuine concern. I reached into my bag and pulled out a soft cashmere shawl I had kept for the drive. "You're shivering, Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. I stepped forward to hand it to her, but Gunnar blocked my path, his arm a rigid barrier. I looked past him to Idella. "Bitterness is a heavy coat to wear. I'd rather you be warm while you decide my fate." Gunnar didn't acknowledge the gesture. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a folder of crisp white papers. The legal letterhead caught the dim light of the porch lamp. It was a quitclaim deed and a comprehensive waiver of inheritance. Under Illinois law, these documents were a formal execution of my birthright. He wasn't just asking me to leave. He was demanding I sign away my existence. "Sign them," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "In exchange, you take the keys to the Ford in the driveway. You leave tonight, and you never come back to this house. You are no longer a liability we are willing to carry." The transaction was as cold as the ice forming on the driveway. A 12-year-old car with a rusted frame in exchange for my future, my history, and my home. I took the pen he offered. My signature didn't waver. It was sharp, clear, and final. I understood then that a signature on a piece of paper can take away my house, but it cannot take away my name or my dignity. I looked up at Gunnar as I handed the folder back. I didn't feel the rage I expected. I felt a profound, quiet pity. He looked so small standing in that massive doorway. A man who thought power was measured in square footage and social standing. True poverty isn't having no money. It's having a heart so small that you'd trade your own blood for a quiet life. That moment changed everything. I turned away and walked toward the old Ford. The sub-zero wind whipped the snow into a whiteout, stinging my eyes and stealing my breath. I climbed into the driver's seat. The interior smelled of stale upholstery and old grease. The engine groaned, a mechanical protest against the cold, before finally sputtering to life. It was a dying machine, but it was the only sanctuary I had left. I looked back at the house one last time. Idella was standing at the tall window of the study. Her hand was resting on the heavy velvet curtain. For a heartbeat, our eyes locked through the glass, a silent plea met by a void. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled the drapes shut. She chose the warmth of the lie over the freezing truth of her daughter. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white and aching. I remembered a line from a book Vonda had given me once, something about seeds. "They think they are burying me," I whispered into the freezing cabin. "But they don't realize I am a seed of something they can never cultivate." I shifted the car into gear, the tires spinning momentarily on the ice before catching. I drove down the long, winding driveway, the mansion shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a ghost in the storm. I was no longer Quartz the daughter, or Quartz the sister. I was a phantom of Lake Forest, a girl in a freezing metal box with exactly $42 in her pocket and a lifetime of secrets in her head. The car's heater briefly stopped working, blowing out a stream of warm air before shutting off completely. I pulled my coat tighter around my chest, watching the taillights of my past life fade into the white abyss. The road ahead was invisible, buried under snow, but I knew exactly where I was going. I was heading towards the only person who had ever truly seen me. The Illinois sky stretched a vast, jagged expanse of gray, shrouded in a thick, suffocating layer of snow that drowned out all other sounds. I pulled over at a deserted rest stop on I-94, the Ford's engine screeching like a last breath before dying down. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on my eardrums with the weight of all I had lost. The hardest part of being erased wasn't the absence of people, but the presence of the cold. My shelter now was a metal cage on a wheel, a rusty container for the girl Lake Forest wanted to forget. Sleep was never deep. It was a series of shallow, shivering lapses. At 3 a.m., a harsh rhythmic rapping on the glass jarred me awake. Blue and red lights strobed against the frost-covered windshield, turning the interior of the car into a chaotic disco of authority. I sat up, my breath blooming in a thick cloud, as a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness. Tallis had been busy. I rolled down the window, the sub-zero air biting at my cheeks. to find a sheriff's deputy looking at me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. The reports stated that the car was stolen or contained dangerous materials. It was a deliberate attack, designed to deprive me of even the right to breathe in peace. I didn't argue or cry. I simply handed over the signed vehicle registration papers that Gunnar had forced me to have, along with my own identification, moving slowly and cautiously. Cruelty doesn't always come in the form of a blow. Sometimes it's a silent, persistent denial of a person's right to exist. I wasn't being hunted. I was being harassed to the point of wanting to disappear from this world. The officer checked the papers, his expression softening as the legitimacy of my presence became undeniable. He returned the papers and told me to leave before dawn. Survival became a ritual of discipline. I used public library bathrooms to scrub my skin with cold water, ensuring my reflection remained professional and sharp. I lived on discounted granola bars and water, treating my hunger as a data point rather than a crisis. True poverty is the loss of one's will, and as long as my mind remained an asset, I was merely in transition. At the edge of the parking lot, I met an elderly veteran huddled under a thin tarp. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. I reached into the back seat and handed him my last heavy wool blanket. "We aren't defined by the dirt on our shoes," I whispered, "but by the light we refuse to let go of." Just as the last of my $42 was about to vanish into a gas station pump, a black SUV pulled up beside the Ford. A woman stepped out, her posture radiating a familiar, steely grace. It was Aunt Vonda. She hadn't come with a checkbook or a lecture. She came with a private investigator's file and a look of absolute recognition. "I was the freak of Gunnar's generation long before you were born, Quartz," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. She told me how they had tried to bury her too, labeling her difficult because she wouldn't be a quiet ornament for their prestige. Vonda didn't offer me a room in her house. She offered me a seat at a different table. She pulled a rugged, encrypted laptop from her bag. "Wealth is the only language people like your father and Talis truly fear," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I won't give you a handout, but I will teach you the syntax of their destruction." She gave me access to a private database of distressed assets and foreclosure filings. Family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who see your value when you are invisible to the rest of the world. That was the moment my survival instinct shifted into a strategy for justice. I spent the next week parked under the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner, the laptop's glow the only warmth I had. I immersed myself in the intricacies of real estate law and debt acquisition, filtering the numbers through a lens of pure logic. To win the game, you must first stop being a piece on the board and start becoming the hand that moves it. I watched Talis's social media from the periphery. Lavish dinner parties and it-girl galas, all funded by the debt she was piling onto Gunnar's back. I chose not to hate them. Hate is a distraction, and I needed every ounce of focus to prepare for the day they would inevitably fall. The rhythmic tapping of the keyboard became the heartbeat of my new life. I was no longer just a girl sleeping in a car. I was a mysterious analyst, a ghost in the machine monitoring decay in Lake Forest. I saw the bridging loans, the high-interest lines of credit, and the forged signatures Talis was using to prop up her failing brand. I was becoming the air they breathed, invisible, essential, and capable of turning into a storm. By the time the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the sky with shades of purple and gold, I had laid the foundation for my own empire. The screen flickered as I refreshed the Cook County foreclosure portal. A familiar address appeared in the Level 1 default section, 1422 Briarwood Lane. My childhood home. The mortgage belonged to an unknown holding company, recently liquidated for private auction. My fingers glided across the keyboard, a cold smile briefly appearing on my lips. They thought I was gone, but I was the only one who knew how to reclaim the life they had thrown away. The transition from a ghost in a rusted Ford to a shadow in the high-rises of downtown Chicago happened with a quiet, lethal precision. I didn't return to the world to be seen. I returned to build a fortress that no one could ever kick me out of again. Every morning, the blue-gray light of the city found me at a sleek glass desk in the Loop, working as a junior data analyst. I was efficient, polite, and entirely forgettable. Exactly how I needed to be. By midday, I was hunkered down in a quiet corner of the Harold Washington Library, writing freelance code for overseas firms under a pseudonym. But it was the night shift that provided the most visceral fuel for my resolve. I worked as a server at an elite private club, a place where the walls were mahogany and the air tasted of vintage bourbon and unspoken secrets. It was a playground for the Lake Forest legal and financial circles, the very people who had once toasted my parents' anniversary. Dressed in a crisp black and white uniform, I became part of the furniture. I filled water glasses and cleared appetizer plates while the men who held Gunner's debt laughed about interest rates and equity. The greatest advantage of being treated like a shadow is that shadows see everything while staying unseen. I overheard conversations about Talas's desperate attempts to secure bridge loans. I saw the legal vulnerabilities in her latest luxury startup, which was little more than a frantic shell game. I saved every dollar, every cent, with a discipline that bordered on religious. Yet I made sure my heart didn't turn into a ledger. On Saturday afternoons, I volunteered at a youth shelter on the south side. I looked at kids who had been discarded by the system and told them the truth I was living. Your current situation is just a chapter, not your whole story. Don't let the ink dry on a bad day. Watching them, I understood that true success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you are worth the effort of being saved. I avoided the burning temptation of early revenge. I didn't want to just hurt them. I wanted to be the immovable reality they eventually crashed into. I was building a fortress of legal and financial stability, brick by silent brick. Looking at the city lights from my modest studio apartment, I knew the foundation was finally set. That's where the tide began to turn. While I was building, Talas was burning. I monitored the Cook County public filings like a hawk. The data told a tragic, predictable story of the golden child's decay. As the market took a downturn, Talas's hollow lifestyle began to collapse. To maintain her social standing, she didn't work harder. She manipulated Gunner's blind trust. Through the public lien filings, I saw the trail of breadcrumbs, a reverse mortgage, then a series of high-interest bridge loans secured against the Lake Forest estate. Talas was lying to Gunner and Idella about surefire investments, but the reality was much darker. Under U.S. property law, she was effectively putting a countdown on the family home. She intercepted the mail, gaslighting our parents into believing the warning letters from the bank were just clerical errors. I watched from the digital shadows as the debt spiraled out of control. A lie can travel around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. But eventually, the truth arrives, and it demands payment in full. Disgust was my primary emotion, yet beneath it was a chilling sense of foreshadowing. I could see the foreclosure notice before it was even printed. My sister had become a parasite, draining the very pride Gunner had sacrificed me to protect. It was a tragic irony I couldn't ignore. Every time I refreshed the screen and saw a new delinquency notice, I felt the weight of the secrets I carried growing heavier. I didn't want to be right, but the numbers never lied. The rot was deep, and the end was coming faster than they realized. One Tuesday night, I drove my now reliable SUV out to Lake Forest. I didn't enter the neighborhood. I parked on a side street and watched from a distance. The mansion sat on the hill, its lights flickering like a dying star. Through the library window, I saw Gunner and Idella. They looked older, frailer, and strangely small inside the massive house. They were trapped in a luxury they no longer legally owned, living in a museum of their own failures. Despite their betrayal, I felt no joy in their coming ruin. There is no victory in watching someone drown, even if they were the ones who pushed you into the water. I realized then that I didn't want to see them on the street. I wanted them to realize that the only hand reaching out to save them belonged to the freak they had discarded. I made a final, decisive move. Through an anonymous LLC I had established with Vonda's guidance, I entered a bid to buy the primary mortgage debt. I wanted to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, it was my hand that held it, not a predatory bank. I didn't lose a family 12 years ago. I lost a weight. And in that lightness, I found the strength to build a house that no one can ever kick me out of. I looked at the old oak tree near the gate and remembered the girl who had shivered in the snow. She wasn't gone. She was just waiting for the door to open. I put the car in gear and drove away, my mind a calm sea of calculated moves. I arrived back at my apartment to a glowing notification from the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. The foreclosure process was officially triggered. The countdown had hit 0. Almost immediately, my phone began to vibrate on the nightstand. It was an unknown number, but the area code was unmistakable. I knew it was her. I knew it was the woman who had tried to erase me, now calling into the void for a savior. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, and I didn't answer. I let it ring until the room was silent again. Silence was my first real answer. I was no longer a shadow. I was the creator. I had the papers, the power, and the house. The only thing I lacked was the desire to be heard again. The next morning, I walked into the office as the dishwashing girl. But in the world's books, I was already the owner of the house on the hill. The silence of the following morning was clinical, a stark contrast to the buzzing vibration of the phone I had left unanswered the night before. I sat in my high-tech office in downtown Chicago, the floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of a city that didn't care about family secrets. Below, the ant-like movement of commuters reminded me that the world keeps spinning even when your foundation is rotting. I ran my thumb over the edge of the legal papers on my desk. They were heavy, official, and entirely mine. I wasn't the girl who cleared plates anymore. I was the architect of a destiny that was finally coming for its due. Then, the phone rang again. This time, I picked up. "Quartz, thank God you finally answered." My mother's voice trembled, urgent and sharp over the phone. There was no greeting, no, "How have you been these past 12 years?" Instead, Idella spoke with such authoritative maternal tone that I felt as if she were standing in the room, ordering me to make my bed. She began to cry, but the tears sounded practiced, like a performance for an audience she considered still imprisoned. "We're in trouble, Quartz. The bank, they're foreclosing on the house. Talis said you've been spending time with Aunt Vonda. You have to use her money to sort this out. It's over $1 million, but surely Vonda won't begrudge the family any money." I listened with a clinical detachment that surprised even me. She was weaponizing blood and duty, claiming my decade of suffering was just a misunderstanding. She told me that as the youngest, it was my role to save the family's honor. "We gave you life, Quartz," she pleaded. "The least you can do is give us our home back." I looked out at the Chicago skyline and felt a profound sense of moral clarity. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to use you as a doormat. It means recognizing they no longer have the power to hurt you. Love is a mutual sanctuary, Mother, not a hostage negotiation. I don't owe you a ransom for the pain you caused. I ended the call before she could respond, the silence that followed feeling like a hard-won victory. The peace lasted exactly 2 hours. By noon, my firm's internal alert system began flagging my name in local Lake Forest tabloids and social media circles. Talis, realizing I was the anonymous buyer of the mortgage debt, had launched a desperate, vicious smear campaign. She had leaked doctored emails and edited financial records, painting me as a corporate predator who had stolen family trade secrets to bankrupt my own aging parents. It was a classic Talis move, turning the victim into the villain to distract from her own rot. My mentor at the firm called me into his office, a digital copy of an injunction request on his screen. Talis was claiming tortious interference and fraud, attempting to freeze the foreclosure sale. The air in the room grew thin. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, their whispers echoing in the hallway. But I didn't panic. I had been a shadow for a decade. I knew how to navigate the dark. A lie is like a house of cards. It looks impressive until the first gust of reality hits it. I am not the wind, Talis. I am the stone wall the wind hits. I spent the entire afternoon preparing my rebuttal. I wasn't relying on emotion, I was relying on solid metadata. I found the original digital timestamps of the loan documents Talis had forged and the bank transfers she had diverted into her personal account. In the US legal system, truth is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. I wasn't just defending my reputation, I was meticulously destroying hers. While she was playing the role of an upper-class lady, I learned to be a truth analyst. By sunset, the battlefield had shifted. I realized I had to stop playing by their emotional rules. To win this, I had to be colder than the Illinois winter that had nearly killed me. I instructed my legal team to accelerate the sheriff's sale. To ensure there were no further delays, I waived my right to a deficiency judgment, effectively telling the court I didn't want their money. I only wanted the deed. It was a high-stakes move that signaled I wasn't interested in a settlement. I was interested in the end of the story. I met Aunt Vonda for a quick dinner at a small diner near the courthouse. She looked at the stacks of evidence I had compiled and smiled. It was the same smile she had given me when she handed me that first laptop. Justice is not about being loud, Quartz, she reminded me, her voice a steady anchor. It's about being right when everyone else is wrong. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do. As we talked, I made a decision that felt like the ultimate act of self-possession. I wasn't going to let them be homeless. I prepared a life estate offer for Gunnar and Idella. I had already scouted a modest, safe apartment in a quiet part of town. I would provide for their basic needs, but I would no longer subsidize their vanity or Talus's greed. It was a gesture of humanity they didn't deserve, but one I needed to give to remain the woman I had become. Integrity is what you keep when you have every reason to let it go. I stood on the balcony of my apartment that night, watching the lights of Chicago twinkle like 1,000 silent witnesses. They had tried to bury my reputation, but they forgot I was the one who built the graveyard of their lies. The door to my past was finally beginning to close, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of the click of the lock. I checked my phone one last time before bed. A message from an unknown number, Talus, lit up the screen. I'll burn this house to the ground before I let a freak like you step foot in it. I stared at the words, my finger hovering over the notify authorities button. I no longer felt the familiar bitterness of the word weird. I only felt the weight of a dying woman's despair. The house was gone. It had vanished the moment they chose sweet lies over the harsh truth. I hung up the phone and fell asleep. The storm had come, and I was the only one who knew how to weather it. The fluorescent lights of the Cook County Courthouse hummed with a sterile, unforgiving energy. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the heavy silence of a room where lives are settled in ink and mahogany. Outside, the world was moving on, but inside this chamber, time had slowed to a crawl. I looked at the back of Gunnar's head, noticing how the once proud posture of the Lake Forest patriarch had begun to sag. Beside him, Idella clutched her handbag as if it were a life preserver in a rising tide. They were waiting for a miracle. A last-minute reprieve. A white knight to save the mansion they had built their identities upon. Talus sat on the far end of the bench, her fingers flying across her phone screen. She was looking for a loan that would never materialize. A wire transfer from a ghost. She was still wearing her golden child mask, but it was cracking at the seams, revealing the frantic desperation underneath. I didn't feel the surge of hatred I had expected. Instead, I felt a deep, resonant stillness. I had spent 12 years as a ghost, and today, I was finally materializing to reclaim the ground they had buried me under. The auctioneer cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Final call for the property at 1422 Briarwood Lane," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "The high bid stands with North Star Acquisitions, LLC." I stood up. My movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Beside me, my legal counsel opened their briefcases, the rustle of paper loud in the expectant hush. Gunnar and Idella turned around, their eyes widening as they saw me, not as the freak in a rusted car, but as the woman who had just purchased their debt. The doors of the courtroom didn't just open. They felt like they were being unsealed for the first time in a decade. Quartz was no longer a shadow. I was the owner. The legal transfer was swift and clinical. I stepped forward to receive the certificate of purchase and the foreclosure deed. I felt the weight of the paper in my hand, a physical manifestation of 12 years of grit and survival. Gunnar's face turned a shade of gray I will never forget. True justice isn't about taking what someone has. It's about showing them that they never had the power to take who you are. He had handed me a bill of exile in the snow, and I was handing him a reality he couldn't negotiate. Talus, realizing the game was over, didn't go down quietly. She stood up, her voice screeching in the hallowed hall, accusing me of corporate theft and predatory fraud. She screamed that I had stolen the family's future. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened a leather-bound file and placed a forensic audit of the family business on the table. The smoking gun was there, highlighted in cold, undeniable figures. Tallis hadn't just been reckless, she had been criminal. I watched Gunner's face as he read the documents. He saw the forged signatures on his power of attorney forms. He saw the empty shell of his 401k, drained to fund Tallis's lifestyle brand. He saw the Social Security checks diverted to a private account in the Caymans. The image they had sacrificed me to protect was a rotting corpse, and Tallis was the one holding the shovel. The betrayal was so complete, so intimate, that it seemed to drain the very air from the room. The sheriff's deputies moved closer, sensing the volatility of the moment. One of them looked to me for the signal to proceed with an arrest for felony fraud. I looked at Tallis. She looked like a cornered animal, all teeth and terror. I shook my head. "I will not put my sister in a cage," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The truth has already done that. A life spent in the shadow of one's own lies is a prison no bars can match." It wasn't about being weak. It was about being better than the people who tried to break me. We returned to the Lake Forest estate an hour later, the legal owners of a house that felt like a museum of lost time. I walked through the halls I once scrubbed as a freak, my heels clicking on the marble with a sound of absolute authority. In the foyer, Gunner and Idella's bags were already packed. Their pride had been replaced by a hollow, terrifying silence. Idella reached out to touch my arm, her voice a fragile whisper. "I always knew you were the smart one, Quartz," she said. It was a statement so transparently manipulative it confirmed my decision to remain detached. I looked at my parents and handed them the final settlement agreement. I had bought a small, comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood, a lifetime right in their name. They would never be homeless again, and they would never lack basic necessities, but they would never set foot in Lake Forest again. Success is a lonely mountain when the people you love try to push you off the cliff. I didn't win because of them. I won because of the girl who had to sleep in her car just to keep her soul warm. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the wreckage of the family I had once craved approval from. Gunnar looked up, his eyes vacant, finally seeing the daughter he had erased. Tallis stood near the door, her eyes full of pure, unadulterated venom. She looked at the walls she had destroyed, and then at me. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice a ragged thread of spite. "I'd rather see this house burn than see you happy in it." I watched them leave, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind me with a final creak. I was alone in the silence of my childhood home, a place now mine by law, but never mine in heart. I had weathered the storm, and I was the only one left standing. I looked at the handcrafted heirloom I had left on the table years ago. It was still there, covered in dust, waiting for the last daughter who had finally returned home as she wished. The sun dipped below the jagged skyline of Lake Forest, bleeding shades of bruised purple and deep orange across the foyer of the mansion. Long, skeletal shadows stretched over the marble floor, reaching toward the center of the room where Tallis was on her knees. Her tears were finally real, but I could tell they weren't born of regret. They were born of the cold, sharp fear of a woman who had finally run out of secrets to sell. Gunnar and Idella stood by the heavy oak door, their figures silhouetted against the dying light, their voices trembling as they pleaded for one more chance. It was a strange, haunting irony. They were standing in front of the same massive fireplace where they had once burned my childhood journals and my research notes, now attempting to use the heat of that memory as a bargaining chip for warmth. I observed them from the middle of the grand staircase, the mahogany railing smooth beneath my palm. The hardest part of moving forward isn't forgetting the past, but accepting that the people who raised you are not the people you needed them to be. I didn't feel the heat of anger anymore. I only felt the coolness of a settled debt. I maintained a tone of quiet grace as I descended the final steps. I had no interest in using their bankruptcy as a blunt instrument. He who seeks revenge digs two graves, and I was only interested in building a life that had nothing to do with cemeteries. "The mansion is sold, Father," I said, my voice steady in the vast, echoing space. There are no more chances because there is no more house to gamble with. But I am not my sister, and I am not the daughter you tried to erase. Gunnar looked at me, his eyes hollowed by a sudden, pitiful realization of his own obsolescence. He had spent decades protecting an image, only to find that the image had no substance when the foundation crumbled. Idella reached out, her fingers brushing the air between us, still trying to find a way back into a heart she had personally locked out. I understood then that some people don't seek forgiveness because they've changed. They seek it because they've lost. I produced a final legal folder from my bag, a thick, blue-bound document containing the deed of trust for a safe, modest 2-bedroom condominium in a quiet neighborhood 10 miles away. I had personally ensured it was fully paid for, stocked with essentials, and furnished with the kind of simple comfort they had long forgotten in their pursuit of Lake Forest prestige. I explained the legal terms with the clinical precision of the analyst I had become. They were granted a life estate, ensuring they would have a roof over their heads for as long as they lived. However, the grace came with boundaries as firm as the stone walls surrounding us. They were legally barred from mortgaging the property or using it as collateral for Talas's ongoing legal debts. Idella looked at the deed, then back at the grand foyer, her voice a fragile thread. Can we come back for the holidays, Quartz, to see the tree in the hall?" I looked at her, seeing the woman who had pulled the drapes shut while I shivered in the driveway 12 years ago. "A house is just bricks and mortar, Mother," I replied softly. "But a home is built on trust, and mine was demolished 12 winters ago." I handed the keys to the condo to Gunnar. It was a gesture of honor toward the role of a daughter, but a final, decisive end to my role as their scapegoat. "I provide for you because I am Aunt Vonda's niece," I told them, my voice echoing off the mahogany. "I do it because I refuse to let your failures dictate my character. Integrity is what we do when the world isn't watching, and I choose to be a woman who doesn't leave people in the snow, even if they did it to me." The movers had finished taking the last of the family's tainted belongings, leaving the great hall feeling like a hollow ribcage. I walked my family to the threshold of the Lake Forest mansion one last time. The air outside was turning sharp with the arrival of night. Talas stopped at the door, her face contorting as she whispered a final bitter curse, calling me a freak, one last time for having the audacity to survive her. I didn't flinch. Instead, I looked at her and smiled. A genuine, radiant, and hauntingly beautiful smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally put down a heavy burden they were never meant to carry. They called me a freak because I could see the cracks in their foundation long before the walls fell. Now, I am the only one standing on solid ground. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence isn't an absence of words. It's a presence of peace. I watched them walk toward the car, taking the same path I had taken 12 years ago, their shadows disappearing into the twilight. With a steady, peaceful hand, I placed my fingers on the cold brass handle of the heavy oak door. I pulled it shut, the click of the lock echoing through the silent house like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The sound wasn't a rejection, it was a liberation. I stood alone in the silence of the hall, moonlight beginning to filter through the tall windows. I walked back to the table and picked up the handcrafted restored heirloom I had repaired years ago. I wiped the dust from its surface, the gold gleaming in the shadows. I no longer waited for permission to exist. I no longer waited for an apology that would never be sincere. I stood in the house I had bought with my own willpower, and I realized that the eccentric had finally found his way home.